Picture a high-stakes poker game that has been played by the exact same people, using the exact same rules, for over half a century. Then, suddenly, someone new pulls up a chair, brings a completely different currency, and starts dealing the cards. That is exactly what it feels like, watching the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East right now.
It really is a geopolitical earthquake. For decades, whenever there was a crisis involving Iran, the world instinctively looked to Washington, London, or maybe Geneva for a resolution, or at least a framework for negotiations. But recently, the diplomatic compass has been pointing somewhere completely unexpected. Beijing.
Exactly. We are looking at a massive structural shift in global relations. Today, we are unpacking a fascinating and complex development: China, stepping into the incredibly volatile arena of Iranian conflicts, not as a distant observer, but as a proactive mediator. Why is the world's manufacturing powerhouse suddenly playing peacemaker in one of the most historically turbulent regions on Earth? And more importantly, what happens to the global order when the architect of the new peace does not share the political values of the old guard?
To really grasp the magnitude of this, we have to throw out the old diplomatic playbook entirely. Western mediation in the Middle East has historically been heavily militarized or deeply tied to political reform. It usually comes with a strict moral and political checklist: change this domestic policy, adopt this democratic norm, or face crippling sanctions. China approaches Iran with a completely different philosophy. Think of it less like a stern school principal handing out detentions, and more like a pragmatic business partner looking at a balance sheet.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The no-strings-attached approach to diplomacy. But let us dig into the actual mechanics of this strategy. When we talk about Iran, we are talking about a nation under immense Western sanctions, heavily isolated from the global financial system. So when Beijing steps in to mediate, what is the actual leverage they are using to bring conflicting parties to the table?
The leverage is absolute economic survival. China is, without a doubt, Iran's economic lifeline. We are talking about billions of dollars in oil purchases, often cleverly bypassing traditional dollar-based financial systems. But it goes much deeper than just buying barrels of oil. It is fundamentally about the Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing looks at the map, looks at Iran, and sees a crucial geographical bridge connecting Asia to the Middle East and Europe. So, when China says to Iran, "We need stability in this region to ensure our investments and our supply chains are safe," Tehran actually listens. Why? Because Beijing is the only major global power writing checks that actually clear.
So it is essentially a peace built on commerce and concrete, not necessarily on shared moral values or human rights agreements. That brings up a really fascinating concept in international relations. I have heard analysts refer to this as developmental peace. The underlying idea is that if you build enough roads, deep water ports, and 5G telecom networks, countries will simply be too busy getting rich to go to war with one another. But let me push back on that for a second. Is that incredibly naive? The Middle East is a region with centuries of deep-seated sectarian, religious, and historical grievances. Can you really just pave over a 1,000-year-old conflict with a high-speed railway?
That is the trillion-dollar question, isn't it? And frankly, it is exactly where the deepest skepticism lies. You cannot just put a shiny new shipping port over a bitter proxy war and pretend the underlying ideological hatred has vanished into thin air. However, we cannot deny the tangible results we have seen so far. Look at the Saudi-Iran rapprochement brokered by Beijing. Almost nobody in the traditional intelligence community saw that coming. Two bitter regional rivals shaking hands in a boardroom in Beijing. China essentially walked into a room where two actors had weapons pointed at each other and said, "If you both put the weapons down, we can build a massive industrial zone that makes you both incredibly wealthy." It is highly transactional, yes, but transactional diplomacy has a certain cold, undeniable logic to it that ideological diplomacy sometimes lacks.
It is ruthlessly pragmatic. It bypasses the emotional and historical baggage and goes straight to the wallet. But let us look at the wider ripple effects of this move. Whenever a new power center emerges and successfully mediates a conflict, the old power center gets understandably anxious. How is this mediation push being digested in Washington? Because for the United States, managing the Middle East has been a cornerstone of its foreign policy since the end of World War II. Seeing Beijing act as the stabilizing force must be setting off massive alarm bells across the Pentagon and the State Department.
Alarm bells is putting it very mildly. It is triggering a fundamental identity crisis for Western diplomacy. For a very long time, the prevailing narrative in Washington was that without a heavy American military and diplomatic presence, the Middle East would inevitably collapse into total chaos. The U.S. viewed itself as the indispensable nation. Now, China is quietly proving that the vacuum left by shifting U.S. priorities does not necessarily lead to absolute chaos. It might just lead to a completely different kind of order. An order where Washington has absolutely no veto power, and where American sanctions lose their bite because Beijing offers an alternative financial ecosystem.
That is a chilling thought for traditional Western strategists, the idea of becoming irrelevant in a region you used to dominate. But I want to pivot back to the reality on the ground with Iran specifically. Iran is currently navigating intense escalations, whether it is regarding the advancement of their nuclear program or the various proxy conflicts flaring up across the region. When things get truly explosive, when actual missiles are flying and red lines are crossed, does China's transactional diplomacy still hold up? Or is this a model that only works in peacetime?
You have hit on the exact, glaring limitation of this entire strategy. It is one thing to broker a diplomatic normalization agreement in a climate-controlled boardroom in Beijing. It is an entirely different beast to stop a live, escalating shooting war. China does not want to be the world's policeman. They have zero interest in sending their aircraft carriers to patrol the Persian Gulf or putting boots on the ground to enforce a fragile ceasefire between warring factions. Their entire mediation model relies heavily on the conflicting parties actually wanting to focus on economic development. If the ideological fever in Iran or among its adversaries spikes too high, China's economic leverage suddenly looks very fragile. You simply cannot buy off a holy war or an existential security panic with a favorable trade tariff.
Which means this new diplomatic architecture might be incredibly wide in its reach, but perhaps not very deep when the foundation shakes. It is a fascinating paradox. China is projecting immense global influence and presenting itself as a peacemaker, yet they are extremely risk-averse when it comes to hard security commitments. It almost makes you wonder if they are just enjoying a diplomatic free ride, while the United States still implicitly guarantees the physical security of the global shipping lanes.
That is the ultimate geopolitical irony. A massive portion of China's oil shipments from the Middle East are essentially protected by the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet patrolling those waters. But Beijing is playing a very, very long game here. By positioning themselves as the neutral, reliable, business-minded mediator, they are absolutely winning the narrative war in the global south. They are broadcasting a message to the developing world, saying, "Look at us. We do not bomb you. We do not lecture you about your internal politics or human rights record. We build vital infrastructure, and we help you talk to your worst enemies." For a country like Iran, which feels constantly under siege by Western hegemony, that message is incredibly intoxicating.
It really forces us to redefine what global leadership actually looks like in the 21st century. We are rapidly moving away from the era of the Pax Americana, where global peace was largely maintained by overwhelming military dominance and a rigid binary alliance system. Now, we seem to be entering an era of a la carte diplomacy. Countries like Iran can choose their economic partners from one menu, their security partners from another, and their diplomatic mediators from yet another. It is a fragmented, multipolar reality.
Exactly. And in this highly fragmented world, China's mediation in the Iranian conflict is not just an isolated diplomatic victory or a one-off event. It is a proof of concept. They are beta testing a brand new operating system for international relations. If this model works in the Middle East, with all of its intractable complexities and historical landmines, Beijing believes it can be exported anywhere. They can take this model to conflicts in Africa, to Latin America, and even to Eastern Europe. They are trying to prove that you do not need shared democratic values to achieve peace. You just need shared economic interests.
It really does feel like we are watching history pivot in real time. We started this conversation by talking about a new player sitting down at the poker table, but it is clearly much bigger than that. They aren't just playing the game. They're actively trying to convince everyone else in the room to abandon the cards entirely and play a completely different game altogether. A game where economic integration and mutual survival trump ideological alignment and historical grudges.
And the profound, lingering question we are left with is what happens when this new, untested system faces its first truly existential crisis, when the next major, uncontrollable conflict erupts involving Iran, and the economic incentives are simply no longer enough to keep the peace. Who will the world call? Will Beijing be forced to step up and become the very thing it claims to reject, a traditional superpower wielding hard military power to enforce its will? Or will their carefully constructed transactional peace simply shatter under the pressure of ancient rivalries?
It is a profound uncertainty, and it carries a heavy price tag if the experiment fails. The architecture of global peace is being radically redesigned right in front of our eyes, but the foundation hasn't been truly tested by a massive earthquake yet. Until that day comes, the diplomatic compass will keep spinning, and the old assumptions will keep falling away. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shifting sands of global power and diplomacy. Keep questioning the narratives, look beyond the headlines, and we will catch you next time.